Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kate King.
And I'm Alex Gökçe. In this episode, Julian discusses the power of compassion to transform ourselves, our societies, and our relationship with the natural world. John is an experienced mental health clinician and meditation teacher. He's been trained in multiple mindfulness-based clinical interventions, as well as mindful self-compassion, and practices compassion-focused therapy.
John lives in an old farmhouse in Australia. He's developing a tree polyculture and regenerative organic vegetable garden. His primary intention is to explore how to live compassionately in balance with all the ecologies and elements of the landscapes we live in. You can get this episode's show notes and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy our conversation.
Today we're with a guest from literally the other side of the world, from Australia, a dear teacher, Julian. Welcome.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I've been a mental health clinician for over 40 years, about 42 years. And I went into semi-retirement last year. I came out of it because of COVID. I'm working quite hard at the moment. I have also been practicing meditation for over 30 years, which I came to because I personally had anxiety and used it to help me with that. And then I also came into the compassion work. Then in 98, I became a shamatha teacher in the Tibetan tradition. I was asked by my teacher to go up for training after it became known that several people in my community had been asking me to teach them meditation. And I was saying, no, I'm not a teacher. Somebody heard about that, and my teacher at the time heard about it, and he had courses to train people in teaching meditation. So I was told to promptly attend the next one, and after it I was told to promptly start teaching.
The world needs you. The world needs meditation.
Yeah, so that was in 1998. So I've been teaching meditation and mindfulness and compassion then since then. In 2005 or 6, I learned mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And then in 2006, I learned mindfulness-based stress reduction in a workshop that John Kabat-Zinn and Saki Santarelli ran in California. And I did that again in 2008. And that was interesting. At that time, I started teaching compassion. And I attended, I think, one of the first intensive workshops with Kristen Neff and Chris Germer in 2011. And for some reason, they invited me to the first ever Train the Trainer at the Barre Institute of Buddhist Studies in 2014. And I met Steve Hickman there. I then went through and became a certified teacher in that, I guess you could call it a tradition now, a lineage of Western self-compassion. And I also now pretty well focus on compassion-focused therapy by Paul Gilbert in my therapy programs that I offer and run. So that's a little bit about me. I came up through the first 9 or 10, 11 years of my life in Melbourne with a tricky family. My father had alcoholism, and there's quite a lot of violence and things like that, and a few personal traumas. And then we moved to the country. So from the age of 8 or 9, I moved to the country, just north of where I am now. That was a wonderful thing. We were, by accident, moved not to a railway commission where most of the people went who worked in the railways. We were sent to a middle-class area of the town in a housing commission house amongst all of these other houses. And I still credit that with changing my environment significantly enough to bring about significant change in my family. And so I think I've had a very fortunate life. When I was about 12, my father gave up drinking completely. So it was quite an amazing thing. And of course, from that trauma, I then started developing anxiety in my mid-20s. I was a bit hypervigilant, and it formally turned into anxiety when I was around about 24, 25, 26, just as that brain is maturing and you think you're on top of the world. And these things come in and go, wham!
Right. And then suddenly you're not.
And suddenly you're thinking, oh, gee, DSM-2 says it's neurosis. Oh, my God. So I always disliked that term. So I decided I'd better do something myself. So that was one of the reasons I took up meditation.
When did you start meditation?
Officially around 1990, I went to a 6-week program run by the Theravadins in Melbourne at the Victorian Buddhist Society, and really picked it up then. But I had been a secret wardrobe meditator. Shh, don't tell anybody. Since the mid-80s, I went to different people, and it was crystals and candles and all sorts of different things. And I was thinking, there must be something easier than this. And I've always also had this interest in ecology and the world around me. So I've always been a gardener. And, one of the most enjoyable things I can remember out of my childhood is one day my mother took me down into this very little backyard in a unit. We were staying in a flat upstairs, and I had to stand there while she's digging over this soil about 5 feet by 2 feet wide against the fence. And then I helped her a bit, but I was a bit curious about what we were doing. And I think I was 5 at the time. She then got these packets of seeds out and we planted them. And then I was stunned. They grew. They were flowers. And there was this wonderful little flower garden, it's about 4 or 5 feet by 2 feet, full of flowers. And I'd never seen anything, like I'd seen plants, but actually growing them sort of gave me this sense of magic. You put this seed in the soil and look what it becomes. That's been a wonderful thing. And from there, I just kept looking and watching about things in the natural world and became increasingly concerned. Now, I want to, before we go any further, just pay respect to the traditional owners of the land that I'm on in Australia. This is a tradition that we do. So I pay respect and I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Bunurong people. The Bunurong people are part of the Kulin Nation, of the indigenous people of this land. They've been on this land for thousands of years, and they never ceded the rights of this land to the whites. And I apologise deeply for any harm I or my family have caused to them. Now, the last part of that I've added because it's something that I only learnt of in the last year. Is I thought I'd better check out, now that I've been living in Bunurong land again for 5 years, if there's any family connection between me and the Bunurong people. I thought I'd better look up, so I did. Well, that was a bit of a shock. I might have one less or one too many. My great uncle, he was on the Lady Nelson, a smaller boat exploring the coast of Australia, and they discovered Port Phillip Bay in 1801, and as they were travelling along the eastern coast of Port Phillip Bay, they had first contact with the Bunurong people, and violence broke out. I think several of the Bunurong people were hurt. They don't seem to record any deaths. I deeply apologise for my family's violence and any part that my great uncle had. He later returned to England on a sailing boat, which was taken by the Spaniards, and he died in a Peruvian silver mine.
My goodness.
As a slave.
Wow.
It's always interesting to find out what your family has
Well, thank you for modeling that. I really appreciate that. And I think it's
Yes.
especially timely here in America with everything we're going through, that we're sort of thinking about our own family legacies of, generations of oppressing people and trying to figure out what to do with that or how to talk about that. So that feels like really good role modeling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a growing tradition in Australia. It's also important to me because when I was 14, I had made friends with a number of Indigenous boys who used to come and talk to me. In 1967, we had a national referendum where they gained the right to vote. And that meant they automatically moved from being the responsibility for the Minister for Flora and Fauna
Wow.
to individual citizens with the right to vote overnight. Bang, no support, no nothing. And every one of those 14-year-olds left school at that time. And by the age I was 40, as far as I was able to work out, they were all dead. And I regularly have a sadness as I remember that stuff. Yeah.
So you had expressed to us an interest in compassion and ecology, which are maybe two words that not all of our listeners put in the same sentence often. So I would love to hear more about that.
Because I've had an interest in ecology, and this has broadened, and currently the world is facing a huge number of potential ecological crises, of which climate change is just really one. I think possibly the biggest crisis we could have is in industrial agriculture, with the overuse of especially synthetic nitrogen and the overall increasing use of the limited supplies of phosphorus we have on the planet. And these things are literally killing or wasting away our soil life. And a lot of it is the chemicals that we now use in industrial agriculture are being washed out to the oceans and creating a further pollutant in them. As many people would have heard, though, we've got an unbelievable decrease in the diversity of life, with anywhere from 50 to 70% decrease in insects around the world, with up to 40% of those insects disappearing in the last decade. And a lot of people know about bees, and imagine the world without bees, and we're very much looking at that. We've very much here in Australia been supplying the USA with fresh bees. And, we've been badly affected now in some of the prime areas through the bushfires that have been caused by the third aspect of ecological crisis that I worry about, which is, of course, climate change, where in the last week we've had temperatures of 104 degrees in Siberia in the Arctic region. And there's now fears of a mammoth glacier slide-off decline in the Antarctica, when just 10 years ago we were told the Antarctica would never melt. Now, these are still long-term things, but they are hastening at an enormous rate in the world. And then there are some things that nobody really ever wants to talk about. Overpopulation. And that's not overpopulation of the whole world. That's overpopulation of those of us who are quite rich, in terms of, at the moment, probably 2 billion of us living very rich lifestyles is of a major concern. Now, that doesn't mean we need to go back to the horse and cart days in any way at all, but we need to come to our senses, I think, on this stuff. And the IPCC studiously ignores the issue of population. And then we have heat, which is an interesting one. And then we have fresh water. There are big issues with fresh water. But probably the biggest issue that we have behind all of these things is Western culture. Western culture is a major, major problem and has a complete lack of the flows of compassion. That's a major issue that we're going to have to face. And those issues are a direct result of the development in the way we've done it of industrialism, and especially since the 1970s, where industrialism wholly accepted neoliberalism and its focus on efficiency and competitiveness. And since the 1970s, we now have research data, it was put out by Curran last year in 2019, to show that each age cohort since 1970s has had increasing perfectionism. And if you've got increasing perfectionism, let's just remember your very senior therapist in your country, Marsha Linehan, said there's 3 causes to the very concerning condition of borderline personality disorder. And those 3 things were, firstly, abuse of any sort of form as a child. Perfectionism was the second one she raised. And the third one, of course, was the average Western family that doesn't validate feelings. Now, when you consider just that one therapist, and there's a lot of other research around now, we need to learn, to relearn, and to re-socialise ourselves to compassion in all of its 3 flows. I see that as one of the major issues as being the cause of the lack of compassion, this increased competitiveness and so forth in our society has been a disaster for us. Well, we've had an increase, I believe, in the self-critic. When I was born, in my first decade, it wasn't that great for me personally, but I recognised there was a lot more communal. Our families got together 3 nights, 4 nights of the week at times. And we had wonderful communality of being together and being comfortable, playing games. And it was really warm and connecting. Gradually, as we developed these new estates of houses, we electrified the economy and marketing came in full force. We started buying all of these individual products. Everybody had to have their own lawnmower. Everybody had to have their own washing machine. This was the sign of an advancing society and community. People started becoming more alienated. It really started to hasten then in the 1970s as we brought in these new philosophies. I think we've actually probably changed our whole psyche.
So this lack of compassion has been causing major problems at the individual, societal, and global levels.
Yes, I think so. I don't often read the Bible, but there's several spots in the Bible where they say, treat your neighbours as you would treat yourself. Well, if we did that today, World War III could break out because our self-critics, we treat 80% of people treat themselves far more harshly than they would treat their good friend. And with compassion, we have these 3 flows. We have compassion to others, which we still feel reasonably comfortable with. But that's starting to disappear. If you look at philanthropic donations in some countries, it's getting much lower. So there is compassion out, which, as I've said, we're still pretty comfortable with it. Receiving compassion, the second one, is quite tricky for a lot of us. Oh, it's okay. No, don't worry about it. It's our common response instead of, well, thank you, of validating.
So kind of rebuffing it a little bit.
Yeah, we tend to rebuff it rather than accept it. And of course, 80% of us are much harsher on ourselves than we are on our best friend. And that's self-compassion, the third flow of compassion. And they're out of balance. They're things that we need to look at. But when you also look at the development of industrialisation and marketing and the way it enhances competitiveness, we have 3 brain systems. You have an achievement brain system, often based around dopamine. We have a fear-based brain system. And a lot of the advertising is about either achieving stuff, being the best you, even in mindfulness. Oh, my word, that shocked me. Being the best you in mindfulness. And I'm thinking, oh dear,
Competitive mindfulness.
The competitive mindfulness.
An Olympic event.
Oh, dear. You too can be an Olympic mindfulness practitioner. Strive on with mindfulness. Oh, dear.
Boy,
Yes.
yes.
That sort of shocked me a bit.
Yeah.
And yet it's moved that way considerably in some quarters. People like John Kabat-Zinn do not teach it that way, but some people in the world do, and that's been spreading as a tool of management of corporations in some places. That achievement brain system and the fear brain system, very important brain systems. There's nothing neither wrong nor right with them unless they're out of balance. And then we also have this affiliative brain system, which is about soothing and contentedness. And that's nearly disappeared in some people. One of the exercises I get people to do when they come into my office is to sit down and I explain these 3 circles to them from Paul Gilbert's work in compassion-focused therapy. And I ask them to draw the size of their circles. The fear-based brain takes up half the page. The achievement-based brain system is a bit smaller than in the circles I draw. The affiliative brain system is sometimes as little as 1/8 of an inch across as a circle, or 2 centimetres. But on an A4 page, that's very little. And this is backed up by research in your country as to how many friends do you have, when a friend is someone you can call at 3 a.m. And in the 80s, I think the average number was 3. And when they redid it a little while ago, the average number was 0. And this is one of the symptoms of what I've been talking about with how we've deliberately brought about changes in our society with all good intention, but not being aware of where they were leading to or where they have led now. And so we have this mad rush to have as many consumer products as possible. And this is the problem when you have an economy that is based on goods and you measure yourself by how big your TV is or how new your car is, etc., etc. And we become more and more competitive, but out of fear. There's nothing wrong with competition per se, but the intention with which we come to it makes a big difference. And our society has got these things way out of proportion.
So how would becoming self-compassionate or more compassionate help the individual, the society, and the planet? What would be the practical, how would the wheels turn?
The wheels, I think, are, in my mind, fairly clear. And I'm still developing this line of thought, this line of discussion for people to consider. But our society is essentially based on the idea that we're not good enough as we are now. We are not good enough as we are. If we were good enough as we are, just me, I wouldn't have to buy that much. I wouldn't have to be going out doing all of these things. And as I've already said, we have this increasing perfectionism. Now, that's an impossible goal. Parts of us are excellent, but we can never be perfect. That's just being human. Not being perfect is just being human. Yet we have this drive that I'm not good enough as I am. And all of these advertisers and marketeers will come in and say, but if you just... I first noticed this with Coca-Cola, with this brown fizzy drink, and all of these people drinking it around a big beach ball on the beach. And the idea was, I got very strongly that in order to be cool and part of this group, I had to drink this brown, fizzy, sweetened drink. And I thought, wow. So I went and got one, but nobody wanted to come and play ball with me. So I tested it and found it wanting somewhat. But most people I saw were suddenly drinking Coca-Cola. We have lots of things. Now, I have some major concerns around this as well. In the 80s, late 80s, neuroscience took off. And before then, we've had other developments take off out of the science. And in order to get them into a usable therapy or treatment, whether it's drug or talking therapy, takes an average of 17 years. So when it's first found or discovered and published, from that point when a new piece of science comes in to it being developed into a usable medication or drug or therapy, talking therapy, on average takes 17 years. Now, it's not just in the medical fields, but also in other fields. And that's an awful long time, but we have to make sure it's safe in our fields of working with people, that it's ethically based, that it's safe, and it does no harm. And so there has to be a lot of trials in there. This is significant. Firstly, we have to do no harm. My concern is there are no such ethics or regulations on marketing companies in the use of that same knowledge, and that they could have it used in their marketing within 6 to 7 weeks of publication. That scares the living daylights out of me. That marketeers, and to use a very old set, the id, the ego and the superego by Freud, you can watch all the ads and see which one of them appeal to which part of that structure in our brains, to that theory of mind, and it's very clear. I calculated when I was about 4 or 5 how many ads a day I would see. We didn't have TV at this stage. I didn't read the papers, but as a 4-year-old, I reckon I would see maybe 30 ads a day when we went for a walk up the shops, and the signs on the shops and the signs on the taxis, the buses or the trams and things like that. Although I don't think they sold advertising on trams back then in Melbourne. Trams are like a bus on rails, light rail. These days, a 5-year-old will get hit by 5,000 to 8,000 ads a day. We as adults get hit by 10,000. Now, when I opened the papers up and I could pretend I could read, I could see all these lovely things that I could look at called ads. So it went up automatically when, to maybe a couple of hundred a day. So that's a big difference between the 1950s and today. You go on Facebook, you're getting hit all the time with ads. Mindfulness helps with that. You become more acutely aware, and you become more acutely aware the more you practice, the more aware you become of, yeah, that's interesting. Ooh, yes, I want that.
Do you have thoughts on spiritual materialism?
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of spiritual materialism around.
Because I think the perfectionism that you're talking about drives a lot of us into workshops and programs and self-help books. And
you too can be perfect if you just come to my retreat. Didn't you know that? It's a really interesting thing, that we are always trying that now these days to improve ourselves. And we come to mindfulness to improve ourselves. If we sold mindfulness as, we just want you to accept yourself as you are, nobody would come to the classes, I suspect.
Right.
So this is a major problem with these things, that we've had the makers and sellers of medicine for well over 3,000 years. And unfortunately, we don't just offer mindfulness. We sell it these days in many instances. Now, some people don't need to, and they have very well-based programs, and they're a wonderful thing. And, when I first came to mindfulness, I had to search and find it. That's totally different today. It's in your face.
Now you have to be a really discerning consumer to figure out,
Yes, yeah, right. Discerning is the word.
So the self-compassion undercuts the perfectionism and the competitiveness that drives the consumption. Yeah.
Yes. With self-compassion, you're learning to bring yourself a piece of goodwill. You're treating yourself as you would treat a good friend in difficulty. No more, no less. But you would be treating yourself as you treat a good friend in difficulty. And understanding you're okay as you are. For sure, we can all learn, but we learn that from our own experience. And when we learn to do that, we're bringing a kindness, a piece of goodwill to ourselves, a sense of compassion to ourselves. that allows me to have a higher level of esteem for my own action to myself. I'm not using any comparative to the outside world at all in doing that. It's okay, John. You're having a moment of difficulty. Know that you're not alone. Okay, I know that I'm not alone. Other people feel this way when I'm having this difficulty. Wow, okay. Take my time. Take my time. May I be calm so I can use a very brief practice in the spot of when I'm having I don't have that set of glasses for my kitchen. Hang on. This is a moment of difficulty. I'm having a sense of loss before I've even got something. I'm feeling I need to go and buy it. Hang on, this is a difficulty. Okay. No, you're not alone, John. That's an interesting marketing track there, and certainly other people are going to feel this in the same situation as you. Take my time. May I know my own needs properly. Is an environmental version of the self-compassion break as taught by Kristen Neal.
I like it, yeah. It also seems like the experience of difficulty makes us want to consume in some way to fix it instead of just being with it in a self-compassionate way.
Well, I'm not sure that we want to consume to fix it or consume to ignore it.
Numb it or something, yeah. Yeah.
To avoid it, and if you've got a sense of loneliness or things like that, you do get a sense of physical fulfillment if you eat. Yeah.
I do,
yeah. I do too. Yeah, I know. It's a real problem, that one. And we've all been sort of semi-trained into it. There's no need to feel this way. Just have some M&Ms.
Right.
M&Ms will solve the world for you.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting thing. And, of course, we all have this. Hamburgers or things like this. The Western world has become the fast food miracle of the whole planet. There are some things that are called externalities about that. In order to have the amount of beef that we want, which is totally unnecessary for good health, we're ripping out forests, virgin forests, and we're creating grasslands with those things so that we can grow beef. It's not just grasslands, like when you start becoming more compassionate just to ourselves with self-compassion, so we feel okay about ourselves, I start becoming more compassionate to the planet or to the world around me. And I can afford to because I'm okay by myself now. And you start becoming more compassionate to the world around me. And I go down to my favourite coffee shop and I get a latte. Melbourne's much better on coffees than America. I hate to tell you this. I know this is a little bit of competitiveness here. I just thought I'd give you another example of it. And I get a latte and I ask them, now, tell me about the externalities of this latte. And she goes, I haven't asked them yet, John. I say, well, when are you going to do it? Because I'll stop buying lattes. And of course, they can grow coffee beans on organic soils and advertise it freely that way and pay people the right salary, 20 pesos an hour or something in that country, barely livable, but that's the accepted salary. When you look at it further, it used to be virgin forest, that they took the trees out mechanically or burnt them. So it's still classified as organic soil. So we have a range of negative externalities. Now, there are also positive externalities, like I have a crop here and the beehives from next door that they own to get some honey and the bees come in. Then I get this positive externality that's not costed into their price for honey, that my flowers are being pollinated by their bees. So we have positive and negative externalities. And so I start asking these questions in the local shops to be compassionate. I do it with a smile, so I'm still getting away with it. And saying, well, this is a piece of education we all need to learn, isn't it? Especially if you're saying you're going to be a natural food shop. And these are important things. So once I think we learn self-compassion, we actually have more energy to be compassionate to the world. One of the things that I'm now doing is exploring this in my own personal world. 5 years ago, I bought a 1 hectare farm. It's 2.75 acres. It's not a farm. It was just a paddock that had cattle grazing on it. And then a year ago, before I went into semi-retirement, I stopped the cattle coming in, and I'm turning it now. The advanced term would be tree polyculture with some organic gardens. I tend to call it an insect hotel. And part of my practice now is every day I go out there and stand in that paddock as it's developing, changing, as I'm planting trees here and there. And I just stand there and listen. And as I've been doing that, I've realised that our world has been taken over, well, I think almost universally, by a social self. That it's the only thing you read about in psychology is a social self. As I'm standing there listening, or as I'm working the soil when I'm planting a new tree, you get these other senses of self. You know, I've been hearing the birds. I've been hearing the ravens for 2.5 years now. And as I listen to them, and they each have names that they announce. And at least I think on one occasion they've saved me as living compassionately with a piece of land and starting to try and explore what this is. What does this mean? I also have snakes here because I have organic gardens. Because I have organic gardens, I have thousands of frogs. So I have increasing bird population. I have snakes coming through. And all of our snakes around here are deadly. So I've had to come to my fear of snakes and learn to stand still instead of run like mad. So it's been very useful for me personally. There is one thing that will teach you true mindfulness, of walking around your property when you know there are snakes there. Your awareness gets way out of your social self. Yeah, when you learn to do that without fear, it's actually a wonderful thing. I have deliberately landscaped it to increase the diversity of stuff on the block and to have ease for me as I get older, because I'm 67 now and I plan to be here for the rest of my life if I can. But I should have at least 15 years if I don't get bitten by a snake. But since we've been here, the eagles hang over more often. We've got a couple of little eagles. They're not the big Australian eagles, which have a 14, 15 feet wingspan. But these are little eagles. We have more hawks. We have more mice in the paddocks. So we have more snakes. The frog population is wonderful. And on the dam, we now have some wood ducks that come in, settle in there a bit. Wood ducks are a form of geese in Australia.
Forgive my ignorance, but what is a paddock?
A paddock is just a piece of grass that sheep or beef sit on. Paddock. It's a very, very big yard. Like it's the paddock is 2 acres.
Okay, like a field. Like
a field.
Okay.
Yeah, I bought a field of weeds.
Got it.
Okay. So you can have paddocks in Australia which are 100 square kilometres up north in the big country, in the desert country.
Yeah.
Down here, our paddocks tend to be 20 to 30 acres.
I see.
But my paddock is a small thing of 2 acres.
Mm-hmm.
Then I have a house and a bit of garden on it as well, and shedding and things like that. And it's a typical Australian farmhouse built in 1960. When we moved to this town just north of here, Warrigal, we had these very large vegetable gardens and trees, and we'd also go out into the natural bush. I'd do a lot of walking in the bush and things like that. And my grandfather would also take me out. And he would point out differences of how the landscape was changing and things like that. And I always remember one day he got the forge going and we were making some hinges for a gate where the hinges had broke. And so he got the forge out and got it going. And he held up this hammer. And he used to swear like a trooper, so I'll cut all of that out. It was a great big forge hammer. And he just said, I just bought this for a quid, which is £1 or $2 American dollars. And I was looking at it. And I said, yeah. And he said, you shouldn't be able to buy this for £1. Think about it. Here's the wood here. It's a good hardwood. Where did this come from? And this thing here, the hammer, the steel, the coal that's used to make this steel and the heat and all the workers who have gone into this, are they getting a fair wage? This really worries me, John. That was one of my first lessons in all of this off him. I still think about that today. What are we not paying for with some of these things?
I think that question of should this cost this feels like a really good one to ask oneself, because I do feel like sometimes you have a sense of that when you pick something up and it feels like, this should cost more, and it, like you're saying, like, what's the labor conditions of the people who made this, or,
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a really big one. I came from a family of smokers, so I was addicted before I knew it. Dad smoked 60 cigarettes, 100 cigarettes a day. And so I was passive smoking for my first 18 years. And when I moved out to the room outside, I started smoking straight away. But I gave up. One of the motivations that helped me give up smoking was realising that the children who picked the tobacco in third world countries were coughing blood at the age of 10 and were often dead from cancers by the age of 14 because they started work at the age of 5 in the fields and they were given free tobacco, free cigars. And when I saw photos of that, that was one of my biggest motivations at a sort of social justice sense and also at a personal sense. Here's what tobacco does. And so I gave up, and I haven't smoked now for about 25 years.
Yeah. When people look around the world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the crises, including the ecological ones. So how do we keep from completely shutting down? And how do we take effective action, which is a big question?
It is a huge question, isn't it? And it's a really interesting one. I'm slowly coming to it because any change that we have to make at a societal level has to be reasonably planned. And that's very difficult when we have the sorts of governments that the USA and Australia currently have, which are very much free market is good type governments. However, there is a whole lot of things we can do. The first is to learn to be healthy ourselves with self-compassion, learning that getting our balance of the compassion flows right, of learning about Paul Gilbert's theory on these brain cycles, these brain systems, and understanding when we're operating from fear and when we're not, when we're operating for the good of our family rather from a personal fear. Our society works on fear, though. So this individual action is very important. However, we then need to work at a communal level and understand that, I think as your wonderful Wendell Berry says, nature is a party to all of our decisions, whether we like it or not. And we need to learn that. We can't keep ignoring the rest of the world and the damage we're doing to it through our own consumer habits. And we have to tackle the myths of the world in doing that. Like there's a myth that If we didn't have industrial agriculture, many people would starve. Well, 70% of the world's population is already fed by small organic farms around the world. You look at India and China, they largely have very small organic farms all over the place that do most of their crops. And so that is very much a very large myth. And if we start supporting small farmers, we will get healthier and healthier crops, and we will get healthier and healthier food. So we tackle one area of this change, such as industrial agriculture, by going to farmers' markets, by thinking about what we consume. We make our own bread, so we control what goes into it. It's a wonderful bread. It's a sourdough rye seeded mix. It's incredibly good. There's advantages these days of being in the country and living on a piece of old farm and developing it up. We also get good apples, or we will soon. Brussels sprouts over here at the moment that we're picking each day are sweet. So sweet. And, you know, our kale, I hate kale. Until I started growing it here, and I realised kale, if it's growing when it's growing in the warm seasons, is very bitter. As soon as you get into the cold seasons, it turns so sweet. And that's the only time you should really eat it. This is cutting down things like food miles and stuff like that. And if we buy from organic farmers or small farmers, then we are improving the quality of our food, we're supporting good practice, we're becoming more self-sustainable. These are all good principles. If you buy from your organic market farmers or from your local food festivals or markets, then you're making a difference every single time you buy. And that's very important. Then we need to work at this compassion, though, between ourselves, of learning kindness. And there's a whole array of doing that, of these things. People have been at me to write a book about it, and I think I may in about a year. I think I may have it done in about a year. I've sort of started it.
That's a good segue, because we're noticing the time and wanting to wrap up. But this has been great, and wondering where people can study more with you or access more of your wisdom and teachings.
Yeah, for sure. My webpage, it's under a little bit of redevelopment at the moment, but it's pretty well together, is www.thinkinghealthy, one word, thinkinghealthy.com.au. Thinking healthy. Very poor grammar, because I'm not perfect. It should be thinking healthily.
Who wants that?
So I
It's impactful.
I deliberately made it thinking healthy, grammatically incorrect. Very few people even realise it. www.thinkinghealthy.com.au. Also, people can write to me on my email, which is on the webpage, and they can go onto my personal email list where I send out various things to individuals. I'm more than happy to do that. I send out a monthly newsletter. During the peak of COVID, I sent out a weekly newsletter with coping mechanisms on it for people, different things to do to not be bored, looking at art galleries around the world, all sorts of things. It's fascinating what you can do online now.
Yeah, that's great.
My Facebook page, facebook.com/john.julian.18. And also I run a page called Mindfulness-based Stress Reduction on Facebook. I do a number of posts there each week. It's very straightforward. I try to post something about mindfulness, the research or the science, several times a week. And there's no other postings allowed, just to keep it absolutely simple and on track.
Excellent. We will share links to those on our website for this episode. So
thank you very much.
Click on through.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for your time, John. This is great.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful chat. I've totally enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.